15 years of trauma surgery teach a man that chaos has rules. I learned them one midnight helicopter landing at a time, splintered dashboards, crushed rib cages, arterial spray beating against my gloves. I learned to anchor myself in anatomy. Vessels run where they should. Bones break along predictable lines. Organs fail in sequence. Even death obeys a map if you read it closely enough. My confidence was not bravado. It was survival. A surgeon who hesitates dies with his patient, if only in reputation. I had just finished a long consulting shift at Harrow County's small, underfunded hospital when the call came. Late autumn rain ticked against the window like a hesitant hand. The trauma bay smelled of disinfectant and damp wool coats. My scrubs were streaked with dried betadine. I was halfway through dictating operative notes, a ritual I keep longhand first, the ink and anchor before uploading facts to the hospital's electronic record. The phone on the desk buzzed once, then fell silent. Rural lines are fickle. Sometimes you catch only static. I almost ignored it. I was technically off duty, but pride is a quiet tyrant, I answered. A woman's voice, steady but touched by unease, introduced herself as Vance, assistant at the Harrow County morgue. They'd just received a single vehicle crash victim, male, mid-30s, massive blunt trauma, declared dead at scene. "Doc," she said after a pause that crackled with line noise, "you ever see a body try to fix itself after it's gone?" I pressed the receiver tighter. Bodies don't fix themselves. Not after a systole. "Explain," I said. She hesitated. "You should come down." I glanced at the clock, nearly 11. Outside, fog pooled over the parking lot, swallowing the single sodium lamp. The road to the morgue was a narrow 2-lane strip between empty cornfields. No traffic, no streetlights, reception unreliable. I'd driven it before, visiting the coroner for rare consults. The building itself, squat 1970s concrete, windowless save for one high slit. Inside, buzzing fluorescents, terrazzo floors dulled by decades of bleach, refrigeration drawers that clattered like loose teeth. Exhaustion told me to stay. Protocol whispered otherwise. An unexplained post-mortem event required verification, especially if an assistant without MD credentials was reporting it. If there was even a remote chance of mispronouncement of death, a surgeon ought to confirm. I grabbed my coat and keys. The rain had turned to mist, thick and slow, blanketing the world in matte grey. Headlights carved tunnels in the fog. Behind me, the hospital lights receded, swallowed whole. Ahead, only the hum of power lines and the unknown. Some cases arrive quietly, on bad lines and worse weather. Some cases end careers. And I felt, as I turned toward the morgue, that something, though I could not name it, had already begun to pull at the seams of the map I trusted. The morgue door released with a tired hydraulic sigh, letting out a breath that smelled of bleach, cold metal, and a sweetness that only appears when blood has met air for too long. Fluorescent tubes hummed above me in slightly different pitches, a thin choir out of tune. The terrazzo floor held the day's footprints as matte scuffs in pale green. At the far table, a woman in a navy scrub top and a canvas work jacket straightened, then stepped toward me with measured economy. "Vance," she said, offering a gloved hand. Former EMT stiffness in her posture, that ready-for-impact set of the shoulders. "Thanks for coming, doctor. What am I here to verify?" I asked. I prefer the question plain. "Precision reduces theatre. Single car rollover on County Road 12, she replied, already walking me toward the central steel. Fog like soup. Driver alone. No pulse, no respiratory effort on scene. Pronounced there by Deputy Harlan under our standing protocol. But she stopped at the table and lifted a corner of the sheet. "He keeps changing." The man could have been anyone, mid-30s, lean, the anonymous fitness of manual work. His chest was a map of blunt force violence, livid contusions over the sternum, abrasions across the ribs where a belt must have failed or a shoulder strap snapped. The abdomen told a simpler story. Seatbelt sign, ecchymoses marching diagonally from hip to opposite shoulder. That diagonal is a warning flag for internal injury. I've seen the pattern hundreds of times. I touched the skin with the back of my fingers. Cool. No recoil. The colour had the flatness of the recently dead, not yet grey, just unlit. I checked pupils, fixed and dilated. I angled the gooseneck task light to interrogate the largest laceration, an oblique tear across the right lower quadrant. Before I look for the anomaly, I said, we align on basics. When I speak to trainees, I start here. Healing, true healing, does not happen quickly. Clotting begins within seconds. Yes, but it's a chemical cascade. Platelets stick, fibrin nets form, then cells migrate over hours to days. Tissue doesn't stitch itself shut like a zipper in real time. If it appears to do that, we're not seeing healing. We're seeing movement, pressure, lighting, or we're being fooled. Mara nodded, jaw tight. Then watch, I leaned in. At the laceration's edge, the exposed subcutaneous fat had the pale beeswax look of every fresh tear. Blood welled in a sluggish meniscus, then pooled in a thin trench along the lower edge. I took the wall clock into my peripheral vision, 11:22, and counted under my breath, a habit I've never entirely broken. 1, 2, 3. The wound edges approximated, drew together, not with the living tremor of muscle tone, but with the mute certainty of magnetized filings sliding to a bar. The glossy fat dulled as if a film passed over it. A thin dark line, coagulum, bridged the gap. It was as if someone had pressed two halves of fruit and the juice had gelled between. My scalp prickled, a childish reaction I ignored. This is not possible, I said, and heard how stupid that sounded in a room that did not care what was possible. Mara didn't move. Wait. At the 7th minute, the clock's second hand labouring around its dial, the line tore. Not burst, not dissolved, tore as if an invisible hand hooked a finger and pulled. Fresh arterial red surged from a vessel that should have been collapsed, its hydrostatic head long gone. The pool widened, eddied toward the table's drain. The smell shifted metallic again, sharp as a battery on the tongue. Muscle posturing, I tried first. After death, calcium floods and fibers contract. Sometimes wounds gape or seams part, or residual pressure in the mesenteric beds. Words that were true elsewhere, wearing masks they did not earn here. Mara exhaled through her nose. Deputy said he saw the dash buckle like a paper cup. No other car. No dear. Just skid, then roll. She tapped her phone, swiped, produced a photo of the scene. A ribbon of asphalt vanishing into fog. A car on its roof, glass sprayed like salt. He was upside down when I got to him. No air entry, no carotid. We did 2 minutes of compressions for the formality of it, then stopped. We bagged, we tagged. He was gone. I checked for residual warmth at the axilla, at the groin, cold. I traced the bruising with my eyes again, looking for that one misread sign that would make the room ordinary. You didn't give epinephrine on scene? No, she said. We don't push in the field post-pronouncement. Good. I don't enjoy the tone I had taken, schoolmaster clipping through a child's homework, but it steadied me. I reached for the overhead light intensity knob and dialed it down a notch to kill glare. I'm going to time it. I fished my pen light from my coat pocket, then set my watch's chronograph. If this is artifact, light pooling, table flexion, your angle changing, then a camera will flatten the deceit. I positioned my phone above the laceration, lens parallel, taping it to the arm of the gooseneck with a strip of surgical tape. 30 frames per second, good enough to catch the edges. Mara watched me work with a look I've seen on nurses I trust. Skeptical patience. The buzzy lamps pressed their mid-range into the back of my skull. Somewhere in the refrigeration wall, a compressor kicked on and made the drawers chitter. At 2 minutes and 13 seconds into the recording, the edges knit again. The micro-beading at the margin fused, darkened, then smoothed like lacquer. My throat tightened. I kept my voice even. Platelets adhere due to von Willebrand factor, I said, then translated as I must for lay people, even when none are present. That's the glue in the blood, but glue does not leap. Mara's gaze flicked to me. And blood doesn't start over. No, I said. At 4 minutes 41, the line tore again. The sound was soft, less than a paper cut. Yet in the close world of the morgue it felt loud. New red, new heat. On my phone screen, the recorded version lagged by a fraction, as any screen does, and for a half second I had the thought that my hands were not where my hands had been. The angle of my wrist seemed wrong, as if a mirror had been turned and I had not been told. I blinked and the thought passed. Chalked to fatigue. Residual intravascular pressure, I said again, knowing better. Or post-mortem gas formation shifting tissues. Another mask. Mara set the sheet down to the man's waist and pointed at a second laceration near the costal margin. It does it there too, she said. Not on the arm, not on the scalp, just the deep ones. She hesitated. And this is going to sound stupid, but it felt like the room leaned when it closed. Rooms don't lean, I told her, because I needed the sentence to exist in the air between us. A stabilizing bar. The clock ticked. The compressor shuddered. My phone recorded. The wound drew together, then split. Pattern. Interval. I wrote the times in my pocket notebook because I always write times. Ink first, then data later. A row of numbers that should have been comfort was merely a list now. A thin fence against something I could not name. I adjusted the phone's placement slightly and, as I did, caught a reflection in the instrument cabinet's glass. My own profile, leaning in. For a breath-long instant the reflection moved before I did. Just a fraction. Just enough that I saw my head tilt to examine a thing my body had not yet decided to examine. My scalp tightened, as if a draft had found a seam. I did not look away from the patient. I have trained myself not to surrender to peripheral ghosts. The brain is a lazy archivist and will misfile. Again, I said, to no one and to the clock and to the body that kept obeying a metronome I could not hear. The edges kissed. The line sealed. The line ripped, Doctor? Mara asked, voice low. We keep watching, I said. We measure until the pattern gives itself a name. I pressed the chronograph, inked another time and leaned closer, though, in the chilled glass to my left, I was already there. The first hour of observation taught me one thing. Whatever law governed this wound was not one I had met in medical school, residency, or the 15 years since. Still, I fell back on the oldest habit I have. When the body refuses to obey, document harder. I asked Mara to bring every piece of functional equipment the morgue owned. She rolled out an aging cardiac monitor, the kind used more for reassurance of the living than study of the dead. Its lead wires curled like black vines. I checked the battery, snapped on 3 sticky pads, and placed them over the man's sternum and flanks. We expect a flat line, I explained, more for myself than for her. After circulation stops and the heart's electrical system fails, there's nothing to capture. No spikes, no rhythm. Just a baseline. I clicked the unit on. A straight green line burned across the small screen. Next came the camera. I repositioned my phone to a fixed clamp, but asked Mara for the morgue's outdated Nikon as well. 2 angles. Redundancy comforts me. I set a stopwatch on the table beside the wound and pressed start. No more guessing intervals, I said. We time every cycle. The air was refrigerator cold, carrying bleach, rust, and the faint copper of blood. A compressor hummed somewhere behind the wall. Each sound was crisp, almost too crisp, as if the room wanted to remind me it was real. At 6 minutes, 42 seconds, the abdominal tear zipped itself shut with insect speed. The monitor, which should have stayed a dead green horizon, twitched. One spike, high and narrow, then gone. I felt my jaw lock. Artifact, I said aloud, though the word had no weight. Artifact means electrical noise, static from nearby devices. There were no devices. The next minute, the wound ruptured again, bleeding bright red. The monitor stayed flat. I wrote the times. Seal 6:42, rupture 7:55. My pen shook once. I stilled it. Imagine. I told Mara because explaining keeps the fear behind glass. Watching a film where a missing frame splices back in mid-reel. That's what this is. A frame that shouldn't exist. She hugged her jacket tighter. Folks around here say the crash road's cursed. Ghost lights, phantom cars. My granddad called them the returning dead. Folklore, I said automatically. I wanted it to be folklore. Stories are how people explain poor lighting and grief. Sure, she said, but her eyes didn't move from the wound. I tried to get a lab consult. My phone screen glowed pale blue as I thumbed the hospital's path extension. One bar, then none. Call failed. I stepped toward the steel exit door. Reception flickered back to life. I moved 2 paces inward. Gone again. The building seemed to swallow signal. No help tonight, I muttered. Mara looked up. So we're alone. We're thorough, I corrected. It sounded more confident than I felt. Another cycle began. This time, I leaned close enough to smell the iron and betadine. As the tissue drew together, a strange visual hitch caught me. Mara's mouth formed a sentence before sound arrived. Lips shaping. You see that? A half second ahead of the words. Then the real voice followed, slightly delayed. The effect was subtle but wrong, like bad dubbing in a foreign film. I swallowed hard. Fatigue, I told myself. Sleep deprivation bends time. Surgeons know this. 12-hour cases can turn minutes viscous. But I had slept earlier, even if briefly. And the Nikon's viewfinder showed something else. My hands in a position I hadn't yet assumed. Already mid-suture, though I stood holding the needle driver unused. I stepped back sharply. Do you ever... I stopped. One does not ask a coroner's assistant if she sees time misbehave. You okay? She asked instead. Fine. The lie was smooth from decades of use. The next seal came quicker. 5 minutes 30. The monitor answered with 3 clean QRS spikes. Heartbeats where no heartbeat. I placed 2 fingers to the carotid out of reflex. Nothing. No warmth. No pulse. The screen might as well have been broadcasting from another room. Another night. This... I started. Then forced calm. This can't happen. Electricity dies with cells. No ion gradients, no depolarization, no wave to catch. Then what is it? Mara whispered. Noise, I said, though I knew noise doesn't bleed. Sweat slid down my spine under the lead apron I hadn't bothered to shed. I have lost patience. I have never lost causality. It is different. Mara broke the silence with a shaky laugh that sounded like surrender. You city guys always have an answer. Still think this is physics? Yes. My voice cracked on the word. The clock clicked to the next minute. My own reflection in the instrument glass twitched a moment before I did. A micro flinch, then alignment. I gripped the table edge to keep from staggering. I wrote again. Numbers, intervals, details. As if paper could stitch the world to reason. Yet each entry felt like sandbags before a rising flood. The wound sealed once more. This time the monitor spiked. And over the flat green line I thought I heard a faint, delayed beep after the fact, like an echo of a heartbeat from another room. Mara's eyes were wide. Doc, did it just... We keep watching, I said, but my voice had thinned. In trauma bays, there's an axiom. Control the bleeding, control the chaos. Tonight, the bleeding controlled itself, and then undid itself to some hidden clock, and chaos, polite until now, was beginning to stare back. The next cycle would come soon. I set the stopwatch again, palms damp despite the cold. The cameras blinked red. The monitor's green line trembled. Somewhere deep in my chest, an unfamiliar tremor answered. I told myself that protocol still mattered, that enough data could tame any mystery. But as the wound began its next impossible stitch, a part of me, quiet, treacherous, wondered if I was the one being measured. The stopwatch stuttered to 0 again, and with it, my patience. Observation had mapped the rhythm. It had not yielded cause. In trauma, you can't watch a hemorrhage into submission. You open, you control. I reached for a scalpel because steel, unlike theory, has edges. I'm going in, I said, and heard how hungry that sounded. Mara stepped to the foot of the table. Phone raised. Recording, she said, flattening her voice into a nurse's calm. The red dot stared back at me like a fixed pupil. Before metal touches skin, you judge tension. How taut the cut will spring. The fats give. The muscles quiet. I placed the blade at the laceration's margin and pressed. The resistance was not the normal elastic pushback of dermis. It was choice. The tissue resisted with a stubborn, rubbery refusal, as if a gloved hand pressed from the other side. I increased pressure millimeter by millimeter. A hairline line formed, then stalled. My own force held in place by something not me. Feel that? I asked without looking up. Feel what? It isn't letting me, I said, and immediately hated the sentence. Flesh does not let. Flesh yields when cut. That is the guarantee that makes surgery possible. I drew a breath, leaned my weight into the heel of my hand, and the resistance gave. Not suddenly, but like a door chain sliding free. The skin parted with sterile grace. A thin sheet of blood spread, warm slick under my glove, and the exposed fat took air. For 3 seconds the world was ordinary. Incision, exposure, assessment. Then the edges narrowed toward my blade, as if trying to incorporate the instrument itself, and the scalpel shivered in my grip as if in a magnet's field. I withdrew. The cut closed around nothing, sealed, then, obedient to the invisible metronome, split again, rebleeding bright. The stopwatch on the table clicked off the seconds like a metronome practicing for surgery. My heart rate had climbed. I kept my hands still by force. Mara, I said, keeping the blade low. For the video, hear me clearly. Healing is not a zipper. Clotting is chemistry. Platelets, fibrin, a cross-linked net. Tissue approximation requires either tension from sutures or underlying muscle tone. None of that is active here. What we're seeing is impossible. Like a cracked glass refusing and then re-cracking on schedule. Then it's not healing, she said. It's pretending. The words sounded juvenile and precisely right. The cycles shortened as if irritated by my interference. 5 minutes became 4:30, 4:20. The air acquired that metallic sweetness again. Somewhere in the refrigeration wall a compressor coughed and died. The fluorescence dimmed a fraction, not off, but down, until shadows took on edges of their own. I set the scalpel aside and reached for a needle driver and 3 Niro nylon. If the wound wants to seal, I will beat it to its own finish line. We'll hold it closed and see if the cycle can pry knots. My voice, as it came out, had a second voice standing beside it. Not an echo, not a reverb, but a synchronized double. The slightest phase offset you'd notice only if you'd lived your life under operating lamps. The sensation lifted the hair on my forearms. I placed the first stitch lateral to the closing edge, taking a generous bite. The needle met skin, and the skin flexed away, like a fish's flank underwater. I followed it patiently. Surgeons win with patience, and cast a simple interrupted knot, square, secure. 1 stitch, then 2. The third I set across the central gap. As the tissue drew in for its now hasty seal, my knot formed at the same speed, surgeon and wound racing toward the same finish. Lights shifted. The morgue's fluorescence thickened into the white coins of OR lamps. The hum rose to the chorus of anesthetic machines. A distant beep, beep, beep began at 30 beats per minute and climbed. A quick glance up showed nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The steel table had a blue drape in one layer of my sight and no drape in another. The dead man wore an endotracheal tube in a version of the room that lived alongside ours, like a glass slide layered over a second. "Doctor," said my voice from the nowhere behind me. Irritated, authoritative, my theatre voice. "Suction." "Get me suction now," Mara flinched. I didn't say anything." "That was me," I said, and I do not know which me answered. I bent to my knots, jaw clenched. The nylon bit my gloves. The wound sealed by itself beneath the stitch. The monitor, still attached to cold skin, threw a sine wave. QRS, QRS, QRS. Patient in VTAC if this were life. I pressed 2 fingers to a carotid that would not reward me. In the overlay reality, a bag valve mask rose and fell under my hands. In the overlay, the abdominal cavity lay open, clean organ surfaces glistening and absent. A space where liver should be, a vacancy left by a theft I had not committed. Time doesn't loop, I told Mara, told the room, told myself. Loops require a medium that can be rewound. In physics, you can replay a file because it's encoded separately from the machine. Biology isn't like that. Once tissue tears, it cannot untear without energy and cell work. Once blood is lost, it doesn't return by decision. The body does not have a rewind button. This, I gestured with my chin because my hands were busy tying, is like trying to watch a live broadcast while someone edits the tape as it airs. It should produce only corruption, not coherence, doctor, she said softly. You're arguing with the weather. Then I'll chart the storm. I knotted the third stitch. Still recording, she reminded me, and lifted the phone a little higher. The screen showed me from above, my shoulders squared, my head tilted to exposure. But the video me advanced by a breath. He reached for the suture scissors before I did, cut a tail, and then I followed him. Cutting a tail I had already watched cut, I set down the driver before my hands could shake. Call the city pathology lab, I said. Ask for their on-call. If we can get a courier for tissue, we might document a biochemical weirdness. I rattled off the number from memory, grateful that memory can be mistaken for competence. She tapped it in, thumb steady. The line rang once, then crackled with static like rain against foil. Another line seemed spliced under it, a hissy version ahead of the clean one. And then, with a distortion that raised every needle on my skin, I heard my voice answer in a tone of preemptive irritation. Harrow County morgue. Jonathan Reeve calling. You're not going to believe this. Mara yanked the phone away from her ear as if burned. Doc! I grabbed it, pressed it to my head. This is Dr. Reeve, I said. But I was also hearing Dr. Reeve respond, half a beat ahead. This is Dr. Reeve. The exchange braided for several seconds, then collapsed into dead tone. The call timer froze at 0:12 and wouldn't clear until Mara shut. The phone down completely. You heard that, she said. Yes, that was you. Yes, calling you. Apparently, we stood a moment in the bleached air while the corpse on the table behaved like a patient who couldn't decide whether to die. I needed something human to hold, so my mind found a name I do not let myself say often. Ethan, 14. Bicycle versus pickup, helmet strap broken, temporal contusion blossoming. I could recite every lab, every dose, every pressure reading of that night. I had done everything right. He had died anyway. The PET scan days later, a map made of black deserts. I did not believe in debt to the dead, but the dead sometimes believed in me. Tonight, standing over a man whose skin chose when to be closed, I felt that old, cold creditor tap my shoulder, where my scapula knots. What did you miss? The question surgeons hate. I forced my attention back to the field. My knots held through 2 more cycles. On the third, the wound sealed around the sutures and then split under them, tearing parallel channels like a zipper exploding sideways. The nylon stayed tied, cutting tiny half-moons into skin. The blood came up again, fresh as if there had never been a previous spilling. The stopwatch trembled slightly on the steel as if the table were humming. Doc, Mara said, you're pale. I'm fine. I wasn't. There is a point where data stops being stewardship and becomes penitence. I was nearing it. The fluorescents deepened again, and with them the layers thickened. The OR version of the room arrived in full. Overhead lamps tearing shadows away, blue drape pinned. A nurse's hand, not Mara's, passing me a suction tip. The monitor in that layer showed a blood pressure, 62/38, the kind of number that makes you bark orders. Overlaid with it, our morgue monitor offered a flat line with occasional lightning bolts, the dead twitching like a lie detector. And then the third layer, clean, silent, terrible, displayed the patient opened midline, organs missing from their shelves, not resected, not retracted, absent, as if a child had removed pieces from a model and forgotten to return them. In the living layer, the patient's eyes opened. They were glassy with midazolam in the way sedated eyes are, half aware, trying to climb a wall they cannot see. His lips moved around an endotracheal tube I had not placed and will never place, and the sound came across the beeps as a frictioned gasp. In the morgue layer, his face was waxen and still, In the third, his mouth was a gape of vacancy. All three lay precisely on top of one another like stacked transparencies. "Doctor," my other voice said, the one working in the bright layer. "If you don't move now, we lose him." "Doctor," Mara said, the one in the bleach and metal layer, "are you with me?" I tightened my grip on the table rail. The cold of the steel bit through glove and skin. My knees wanted to bend. Panic is a cheap anesthetic. Intoxicating. Useless. And if you inhale it, you forget the next step. I forced my breath down my throat until it hurt and found the next step. "Count," I said. "We anchor with numbers." I read off the times aloud so that at least one of me would hear. Seal at 2:55. Rupture at 3:41. Seal at 4:07. Each word hammered a nail into a plank over a widening hole. The 3 rooms did not collapse. They steadied, as if hearing me challenge them to hold their shape. In the living layer, the man began to beg around his tube. The vowel sounds sweet and terrible, like a child asking to go home. In the emptied layer, a suction canister gurgled with nothing. In the morgue, the drain whispered as another round of blood found its slope. I set my hands flat, one on either side of the laceration, and did something I have not done since the first year of residency, when an attending taught me how to slow my mind. I named what I saw, simply, like a checklist: skin, fat, fascia, suture, blood. The words steadied the trembling in my hands. "Doc," Mara said again, softer, as if not to spook an animal. "What do we do?" I looked at the knottails, black on pale skin. They trembled in a breeze that did not exist. "We go one step further," I said, though every part of me wanted to flee my own body. "We hold the wound through a full cycle, and we see if anything in this room still answers to cause and effect." The emergency lights throbbed once, twice, then settled into a low, predatory hum. The 3 layers leaned closer together until edges bled. Somewhere my other self barked for suction. Somewhere, my absent self stared into a cavity that should not be empty. Here, my immediate self lifted the needle driver again, and all of us reached for the same stitch as the next cycle began to close like a hand. Midnight arrived the way true night does in rural places. Suddenly, without fanfare, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere far beyond reach, the morgue felt hollowed by it. Outside, the fog had thickened into a white tide. Inside, the fluorescents flickered, then steadied into a dimmer, sickly glow. A low hum, maybe the emergency generator warming itself in some forgotten closet, vibrated faintly through the floor. I felt the room tilt again, just slightly, as though the building's foundations had become fluid. I stayed at the table, palms flat against the steel, watching the wound I'd tried to tame. The sutures lay intact yet irrelevant. The tissue beneath them had closed, opened, and closed again around their black loops, turning the nylon into something absurd, like tying a bow on water. I forced my voice into the room. "Vitals check." Saying the ritual aloud gives shape to fear. I pressed the carotid, still nothing. The skin was cool, pale. Yet the monitor crackled with activity. Irregular, jagged beats skittered across its screen in no pattern I recognized. They were not the flat, hopeless line of a corpse, nor the sinus pulse of life. They were a language with no alphabet. I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. On 3, the screen answered with 4 quick spikes, then stopped. My fingers felt only stillness. Impossible. I spoke it softly, almost a prayer. Impossible. Then louder to Mara. Electric activity without circulation is artifact, but artifact doesn't pump fresh blood. I pointed to the drain, where crimson streaked anew, bright as though tapped from an artery. "See? That's oxygenated." Mara's lips parted but made no sound. She hugged her jacket around herself like a shield. "I'm anchoring to science," I told her. Maybe told myself. Cause and effect. Dead cells don't fire. Blood doesn't oxygenate itself. Tissue doesn't tear after knitting. The room didn't care. The fluorescents winked twice and failed. For 3 seconds we were blind except for the green heartbeat trace, which suddenly marched in clean, undeniable QRS complexes. Then backup lights bled to life, dim orange, predatory, casting our shadows long and crooked across the floor. And with that shift, the layers came fully. At first it was subtle. A second me, ghostly, leaning over the table with scalpel poised. Then a third, older, younger, I couldn't tell, stitching in frantic speed. Beyond them, another room entirely. Blue or drapes, a nurse suctioning, a ventilator bellows rising and falling. Monitors bled across each other. Flatline overlaid with VTASH overlaid with a healthy 92 BPM. My hands in this world trembled. My hands in the others worked with perfect precision. Mara whimpered. "There are 2 of you," she whispered. Then, 3. "Focus here," I said, though my own eyes betrayed me, darting from layer to layer. Each seemed equally solid. Each felt like now. And then understanding struck me with the slow horror of a curtain being drawn. The wound cycles were not random. They matched decisions. Every time the tissue closed, it birthed a version of me who had acted. Clamped sooner, opened wider, transfused, or refused. Every rupture was the branch failing and discarding itself, leaving only the next. This man's body, or my mind, was replaying every fork of care as if searching for an answer I'd never given. Medicine lives by causality. Do X, get Y. Tonight causality itself was tearing. I swallowed bile and forced my hands back to work. 1 act left, assert control. "I'm suturing through the closure," I said, both to the room and the other selves. If I could stitch faster than the cycle, maybe I could pin the wound into one timeline. I threw a stitch as the next seal began, my other selves echoing, some faster, some slower. For a second, we were synchronized, an obscene dance of possibilities. The thread bit and locked. In one layer, success. The edges stayed closed, bleeding stopped, the monitor stabilized at 84. In another, failure, suture pulled free, blood fountained. In another, the tissue swallowed the knot like water taking stone. I saw my own face across those worlds, one relieved, one horrified, one blank. The soundscape layered, ventilators, all chatter, silence, Mara's shaky breath. I almost screamed just to know which throat the sound would leave. Then, in the living surgery layer, the patient's eyes opened, glassy but aware, tracking me. His lips moved around the tube. In our dim morgue world, the corpse's mouth twitched, almost imperceptible. The other layer, the gutted, absent one, gaped in eternal scream. The living version tried to speak. I felt the shape of the words without hearing them. Choose, or you, or again. The meaning slipped like a wet suture. My knees nearly buckled. 15 years of triage and shock rooms had taught me composure. Tonight it failed. Causality can't fracture, I muttered. It can't. Saying it felt like begging. The monitors disagreed. All of them. Dead. Alive. Absent. Shrieked in unison. A single sustained tone that was not alarm but judgment. I looked at Mara. She was pressed flat against the wall, phone hanging useless in her hand. Her eyes were wet, her face bloodless. "Doc," she said, voice almost gone, "you're everywhere." I could not answer because the truth had arrived. This wasn't his case. It was mine. Every decision I've ever made, every clamp placed, every chest cracked, was here. Rewinding, revising, auditioning outcomes. The universe was cutting and recutting me the way I'd cut him. I leaned closer to the corpse, to the man still, and spoke low enough that only one layer, maybe could hear. "I did everything right," I said. "I always did." The wound closed one last time. All my other selves leaned in as one. The corpse's eyes remained shut. The living man's eyes locked on mine. For a moment, silence, real, heavy, absolute. Then the world snapped back to one room. Orange backup light, stainless table, my sutures lying absurd across a chest that should not move. The monitor died to flatline. The generator hum stilled. Only the smell of new blood proved any of it had been more than exhaustion. I staggered a step back, breath tearing at my throat. Mara slid down the wall to a crouch, shaking. Somewhere deep inside, the part of me that believes in maps, anatomy charts, cause and effect flow, understood it was broken. The wound had not just cycled, it had taught. It had shown me that there is no single fixed outcome. The body, my choices, could be rewritten, endlessly. And if that is true, then every protocol I've lived by is only a suggestion the universe sometimes accepts. I stared at the still corpse and whispered, almost kindly, "You win." The emergency lights buzzed once more and settled. Outside, the fog thickened against the glass, pressing white and soundless. Behind me, somewhere I could no longer see. The other operating rooms kept going. Dawn arrived as a pale grey smudge behind the morgue's high-slit windows. No sunrise, no promise, just diluted lights spreading over concrete and farmland. The backup lights cut out with a pop. Fluorescents hummed back alive, cruel in their ordinariness. For a moment I wondered if I'd dreamed the night. Then I looked at the table. The body was inert now, but the steel beneath him looked as though it had endured a week of surgery and slaughter. Coagulated clots ringed the drain. Dried and fresh blood mingled like tree rings of time that shouldn't exist. My sutures, those simple, confident knots, sat useless, some buried under new fissures, some snapped. The stopwatch lay where I'd dropped it, face fogged with condensation. My phone's battery was dead, though I had not left its camera running long enough to justify it. Mara hadn't moved from her corner. She sat on the floor, back against the cold tiles, phone in her lap. When she looked up at me, her eyes were swollen and raw. "I'm not signing anything," she said. Her voice was sanded down to grain. "You don't have to," I replied. My own voice startled me. It was hoarse, scraped flat. "You shouldn't." I turned to the steel counter and pulled a fresh death report. The form is standard. Demographic data, cause of death, circumstances. My pen hovered at cause. Exsanguination secondary to blunt thoracoabdominal trauma. That part was safe. The part that wasn't. The cycles. The impossible healing. The perception fractures. Had no code. There is no ICD entry for reality failure. For a long moment I considered honesty. Tissue regenerated and reopened on a timed interval. Perceptual duplication observed. Cardiac electrical activity without circulation. I could imagine the autopsy review board's reaction. Psychotic episode, fatigue delirium, substance abuse check. Surgeons don't survive those whispers. So I wrote what could survive. Pronounced dead at scene. Blunt trauma consistent with high-speed rollover. Wounds observed with intermittent post-mortem muscle contraction. Possible gas artifact. Time of death confirmed. I stopped before gas artifact. The lie tasted chalky but safe. I initialed and signed. Mara rose slowly, wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm done here," she said, not to me, but to the room. "This job. This building." She stripped her gloves and dropped them into the red bin. The snap was final. I nodded once. Fair. When the coroner's chief arrived at 8, I handed off the form and said little. He glanced at the sutured, cooling body and muttered something about sloppy EMS pronouncements. I didn't correct him. I drove home on fog-wrapped roads with the radio off, hearing only the soft rattle of my keys. For 2 weeks I tried to return to normal. I scrubbed in on simple cases, appendectomy, splenic lac, pelvic fractures. My hands still moved with competence. My mind no longer trusted them. Every time I clamped a bleeder, I imagined the tissue laughing, preparing to unseal when my back was turned. Each patient's monitor looked suspect. Any blip could be a ghost heartbeat. The certainty that once underpinned my work, the quiet mantra "every wound obeys anatomy," was gone. I had seen a wound ignore anatomy, ignore death, ignore time. I had seen my own decisions multiply like spores, entire surgeries flowering and dying in an instant. How could I tell a family that I had done everything possible when everything might be infinite? I lasted one more night on call. A teen came in after an ATV rollover, blood pressure tenuous. As I prepared to open his abdomen, I felt the air of the OR tilt. Subtle but there. My gloves trembled. I imagined the other rooms stacking, versions of me already failing or succeeding. The idea crushed the air from my lungs. I handed the case to a colleague under the pretense of migraine and left the hospital before dawn. The next day, I resigned. I told the department chair I was burned out. He nodded. Surgeons burn out all the time. He did not ask more. Weeks later, in the small hours when sleep is weakest, I still wake to the table. I see the man's abdomen knitting itself, the sutures going slack, the blood restarting like a faucet. I hear my own voice on a phone call I haven't yet made. I feel the room lean. In the dream, sometimes I am the doctor, sweating and dictating vitals. Sometimes I am the patient, cold and open, waiting for the next attempt to save me or let me die. Sometimes I am both, a loop stitching and tearing forever. Some wounds do not close, not in flesh and not in reason. I don't know if I'll ever operate again. The map I trusted is torn, and once you've watched the world splice its own tape and invite you into the edit bay, you stop believing in final cuts.